So we are taking on Anthony Doerr's writing advice that is to work in short chapters today. And if you've read my recent work, you might be interested in what I think about this specific piece of advice. Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppie. You can find out more about me at danielpoppie.com. If it is your first time here, How to Write Good is a writing podcast that seeks to find principles and advice that can be applied across a broad range of writing situations. If you've been here before, don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button below, and share. So I like working in short chapters. I enjoy trying to show a specific scene or event or expression of a character, whether that's an emotion or what they say. I enjoy saying that in as few words as possible. And because I actually work in short chapters, more people are willing to read my books, because if you work in very long chapters, people are they often feel bogged down by the chapter. They often read a couple chapters and they realize they've got 26 more chapters to go, and they don't feel like they're getting anywhere. The short chapters allow a person to pick up the book, read, and then set it down and maybe pick it up again. They don't feel like it's as difficult to get through that book because there are smaller steps to get through the book itself. But that's actually not the reason why I think Anthony Doerr gives this advice of working in short chapters. I think it's a little different, and I'm going to explain why I think he gives this advice. And it's from the writing side of things, not the reader side of things, though the readers can be benefited by short chapters. But the first question we need to ask is, should you do this? If no, why not? If yes, why? Why should you or should you not work in short chapters? So the first thing I want to say is that this advice is not applicable to all situations, right? I can think of one book that works well with a long narrative format that actually does not have short chapters, but it doesn't have chapters at all. It's The Old Man and the Sea. It's one long narrative, and I think that book would have been, what would you say, what would I say about this? I think that book would have been a lesser book if it would have broken up its narrative into short chapters, which it could have done, okay? And I can think of a lot of other situations, or I can perceive or imagine a lot of other situations where having a longer chapter is better than having a short one. It might be the case that you're trying to express a specific thing, or you might need to have a longer chapter to show an amount of time has passed, or whatever. You can't fit the actions or the events that are happening into a short chapter in a way that works well. So I am not going to say that this advice is applicable to every single situation. I think there are definitely situations that you should avoid using short chapters, and you have to use your best judgment when you go into those situations. You just have to learn, you have to get enough practice as a writer to see what is going to work and what is not going to work in that specific book, in that specific chapter, etc. Some of my favorite chapters I've written are longer chapters, and some of my favorite chapters I've written are shorter chapters as well, so it doesn't really matter which type you write. You can write a good short chapter and you can write a good long chapter. So why would you, or why should you work in short chapters in some instances? Why are short chapters of value? Because that's what Anthony Doerr is saying. He's saying that short chapters are of some sort of value and we should use them. So I think it really comes down to editing. Have you ever sat down to edit a 20-page chapter? Have you ever sat down to edit a 20-page chapter that has a fair bit of complexity written into it? I like to add a lot of complexity into my chapters. I don't know how you write specifically, but when I write, and when I get to the fullest extent of my writing ability, what I do is I'm trying to weave every little piece of that chapter together and then try to weave every piece of that book together. Now, I don't achieve that the way I want to achieve it, but at the same time, I'm trying to do that. When you approach a larger chapter, and especially when you have written that chapter in a complex way, it is a lot harder to edit the chapter, because if you change one piece of that chapter, you have to oftentimes change every single other piece of that chapter. Otherwise, it doesn't fit. Even chapters that are simple but are longer are still interconnected. Everything is supposed to flow together in a specific way. Everything links up. You should have, the chapter should circle around one specific thing if you really want to talk about how chapters work. That's a little bit more philosophical on that side of things, but I do think that each paragraph should swirl around a single thought. And then a chapter should circle around a specific vignetted experience. It's very, I don't know exactly how I would say that, but the chapter should be interconnected, right? That's why we put it as a chapter. The chapter is interconnected, whether or not it's simple or complex, just because of the fact that if it weren't interconnected, we actually would be breaking that chapter apart in different ways. So even simple chapters that are long are more interconnected and complex than you would think. And when you change one thing, you often have to change other things within that chapter to make that chapter make sense. So instead of just editing one portion of the chapter, you actually have to go through the whole chapter. You have to check that chapter again. You have to make sure you didn't do anything wrong or you didn't change anything that's going to change the meaning of the chapter, etc. Now, with short chapters, I don't know if your book is less complex because of short chapters. It can be less complex, but I don't think it's necessarily less complex if you have short chapters. So I think you can take short chapters and you can put them into a book in a very complex way, but writing a book and editing a book in short chapters is easier because you're making the book modular. And that's where I think this idea of using short chapters makes a lot of sense, especially if you are a newer writer. If you are a newer writer, I would encourage you to work in small chunks for everything. I would encourage you to write short stories. I would encourage you to write short books. I would not encourage you to write a big book like I did for my first book. I would encourage you to work in smaller chunks because it takes you less time. It's a smaller hurdle to get over. And what you can do is you can teach yourself how you do specific things in writing. And when you get to that big, huge project that you're working on, you will be better prepared to write that big project. So I said that if you work in smaller chapters, you are making the book or the chapters themselves more modular. So what does that mean? So when I think of something that is modular, I think of a piece of technology. So imagine a cell phone that is modular. What you'd have on the back of the cell phone, you'd have these little nodes or you'd have these little connection points. And what you could do is you could buy different things for the phone and you could attach it to the phone on the back, right? You could buy a different type of camera. You could buy a different battery and stick it to the phone on the back. I don't know, a kickstand maybe. Maybe you want a different microphone on your phone, etc. And all these different pieces have the same connector points. They have the same, they connect to the phone in the same way, right? I can put the camera anywhere I want on the phone. I can put the kickstand anywhere I want on the phone. I can put the microphone anywhere I want on the phone because all the things that connect this to the phone are the same on the back of these pieces. And I can move it around. So if I have a modular machine, this machine is able to be configured in tons of different ways because of the way that these pieces can interconnect. They all have the same connection points, so I can put this machine together in a lot of different ways. In a way, Legos are modular, actually. There's these specific blocks we have, and we can put these blocks together in any different way because all the Legos connect together in the same way, if you want to think of it that way. And when you work in short chapters, you can also make your chapters modular as well. So when you do that, each chapter is going to be more independent than usual. Okay, so each chapter is generally self-contained anyway. But now each section of each chapter, each little vignette you're creating is more modular. So what you can do is you can move it around better. So if you're like, well, I want this chapter at the end of the book, or I want this chapter at a different point, you don't have to rip it out of a larger chapter and stick it at the end. You can just take the whole entire chapter, drop it in the end, make the adjustments you need to make it make sense in that instance, and then you can rework the book if you need to in that way. But in a lot of cases, you don't need to rework the book. And I think this is where the power of smaller chapters comes in. They function as modular entities. Each of them is their own small story you're telling, and you only need to work on this small little piece before moving on to another small little piece and changing that as well. And I think this piece of advice that Anthony Doerr is talking about, this idea of working in short chapters, I think it really comes down to a joke, or maybe it's a parable or a proverb you might want to say. I don't know what you'd call it. But the joke is, how do you eat an elephant? I've said this before. How do you eat an elephant? And the answer is one bite at a time. And that's what we're doing when we are working in smaller chapters. We're breaking things down to smaller pieces so that they're chewable. There's something we can actually work on. And as we progress as writers, we can work on bigger and bigger and bigger chapters if we want to, if we find that useful. And it won't be as daunting because we already know how smaller chapters work. If you enjoyed this podcast and you want to support me, there's really one simple thing you can do. You can go to danielpoppie.com/newsletter and sign up for my newsletter. And when you sign up, you'll actually be able to get access to my publication roadmap. So that's everything I have planned for pretty much every project I have into the next decade. Again, that is danielpoppie.com/newsletter. You can also find the link below.